Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the U.S. Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon of March 28th, 2021. My name is Gennady Stolyarov II, and I'm pleased today to offer you this discussion of climate change and potential technological solutions to it. We have a great panel for you of U.S. Transhumanist Party officers and members, including our Director of Applied Innovation, David Shoemaker, our Director of Visual Art, Art Ramon Garcia, our Director of Scholarship, Dan Elton, our member, Jason Geringer, and our special guest for today is Viva Cundliffe. Viva Cundliffe is an environmental engineer who completed a master's thesis in March of 2018 and completed a doctoral dissertation preprint, which is awaiting defense. She owns a startup company since 2010 and completed 5 successful prototype developments that led to a final design for production of hydroxyl radicals. She is the first chemist who sublimated carbon dioxide directly back to a carbon solid, made a pure carbon gas stream, and separately generated doubly ionized oxygen ions in the lab. She also discovered how to produce a new radical, doublet hydroxyl, and characterized how it acts when released. Viva was the inventor of the carbon dioxide-based oxygen supply system for use on Mars and served on the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics Science and Technical Committee for Colonization of Mars for 5 years and was nominated for a Chemistry Nobel Prize in 2012. She has been a member of the Association for the Chemical Profession of British Columbia since 2010, and she believes that all climate and weather modification and environmental management can be achieved in a non-toxic way using oxygen and its positive and negative ions. So there is a lot in her scientific work that we are hopefully going to learn about today. Viva, welcome to our virtual Enlightenment Salon. It's a pleasure to have you join us.
It's certainly an honor to be asked to talk to you, and obviously I checked into your party platform, and I'm very excited to know that you exist and that you're growing, and your credibility is already very high with me in terms of your platform. So thank you very much for the honor.
Yes, thank you. And you have a slide presentation to share with us about your work, so we are looking forward to seeing that.
Okay, here comes about 22 slides. So I'll just get it up from the slideshow. So here we have the hydroxyl, which the word itself is derived from the hydrogen and the oxygen. And this is a diagram of a hydroxide ion, which has one more electron than the hydroxyl radical. So that difficult term is very descriptive of what it's made up of. So just as an introduction to the hydroxyl radical, our fresh air is often the result of the work of the common hydroxyl radical around us. This radical was only well understood by around 1994 in science because it kept appearing in so many different points in the atmosphere's chemistry that it just simply became recognized as the main cleanser. So, you know, in the 200 papers that deal with parts of it, there, you know, it became really understood only by 1994. So we have about 10 to the 5th, 10,000 to a million hydroxyl radicals in every cubic centimeter of air, but it varies for several reasons due to moisture content and how much sunshine is available in the air that is being measured. And it's historically known that the hydroxyl is basically responsible for both pollution and greenhouse gas levels. But currently, we've gone a little bit further than being able to rely on it, and I will explain why. The hydroxyl goes by different names that are worth mentioning. The number one pollutant, zinc, Mother Nature's atmospheric cleanser, the detergent of the atmosphere, Mother Nature's silver bullet, and it is the actual Pac-Man of pollutants for the atmosphere, for those of us who appreciate the Pac-Man concept. We have overwhelmed the system, but here is what it normally looks like. We have OH in the middle, that's the hydroxyl, and it interacts on 4 main arms of chemicals which branch out into all of the whole atmosphere and create removable compounds by the chemistry of the hydroxyl contacting with it. So this is what the central nexus of the hydroxyl chemistry looks like. We have nitrous oxide, ozone, hydrogen peroxide, and then the methane related chemicals around here, which are subject to UV light as well. So sunshine plays a very large role in the formation of the hydroxyl radical. Here is another central nexus diagram as well. This is the chemistry that happens in the troposphere for the hydroxyl radical. Different things happen up in the stratosphere with it. But this is basically Mother Nature's sewer system. And we want to actually remember that it is a reactive oxygen species. And in the body and in our world, these reactive oxygen species serve in critical defensive activities, both inside the body and outside in our open atmosphere. They're small, short-lived oxygen-containing molecules that are chemically highly reactive, a property that is mainly due to their unpaired electrons, which makes them a radical by that statement. They are the superoxide, which is O2 minus, hydrogen peroxide, the hydroxyl radical, hypochlorous acid, lipid peroxides, singlet oxygen, and ozone, which are some of the most common and more core reactive oxygen species. The first two species are the most important reactive oxygen species in the regulation of biological processes. O2 minus is usually the species from which other reactive oxygen species generate. So it creates a very helpful chain reaction to have this in one of your immune cells, because it will burn the cell wall of any invading species and thereby either critically injure it or render it inert, which is the main function of reactive oxygen species. So when we talk about our oxygen and longevity, the common hydroxyl radical is the most neutral primary reactive oxygen species, and life has evolved to easily tolerate it. It is FDA approved for indoor air because of this long history. And air pollution alone, we know now, kills over 8 million people a year, and our greenhouse gas levels are now also lethal to different segments of the population, including 1.5 billion people who are at risk of losing water, food, crops, homes, which put us all at risk. And we, very dramatically can say that as we kill ourselves, we're killing other people. It's a bit of a paradox that we're trapped in right now. So we thought we couldn't affect it, but we know now that we can damage it very dramatically. And the greenhouse gas levels are actually accelerating along with pollution, and it's partly because the hydroxyl and all the oxidants are overwhelmed. So what we can do is we can take all of the different greenhouse gases and the criteria air pollutants, the caps, and put them on a simple spreadsheet, which I have in front of you here. And we can add them up in parts per billion to see what's going on in a volume of the atmosphere. So we know that there is a certain amount of pollution that we can tally up. And then the reason we do this is because the hydroxyl is indiscriminate. We need to know the total that it reacts with. And then we can understand how much we have to apply to meet that total with the same total number of hydroxyl radicals. So this calculator, I just wanted people to see how actually straightforward this is. It's very straight math. And in this particular sheet, we also have an area where you can add, say, 1,000 parts per billion of the hydroxyl, and it will add up to a total flux here, so we can get a feel for how much we can add to match it. So this also gives us a calculation of what % of all the pollutants are greenhouse gases and what % are the criteria air pollutants that we react with. And so we can apportion the actual credit we take for removing greenhouse gases with that calculator. So we need to understand that hydroxyl is part of a self-cleaning natural sewer system of the atmosphere. And it's really contributed to a pretty high quality of life because it takes a concentration-related pollutant load off of animal and human lungs, and therefore is key for health and longevity. This self-cleaning sewer system has limits and has been shown when we compare its levels to the pollutant levels. In the calculator, it shows that we have about 13% of the pollution that we currently put into the atmosphere is what the hydroxyl can remove now. It used to be over 100, but it's now down to a 13% effectiveness level. So that's very important. Now, to produce it, there are different ways, but the technologies are all basically quite simple. So that makes things affordable in terms of looking at it as a greenhouse gas and a pollutant removing opportunity using the hydroxyl. So here in front of us, we have a ceramic tube, and what we do is feed polluted air in from the left-hand side. And the oxygen component of the air, which is about 21.9%, is removed through the actual surface of the ceramic with the help of a little bit of heat. And it forms atomic oxygen, which is an oxide radical. And once that stream contacts with water, it then forms the doublet hydroxyl. So we can make certain that because it really, the oxide radical likes to react with water, it's the highest priority of reaction, so we can rely on it to go out and form hydroxyl for us in the open environment. So that's the O stream that comes off the side of the ceramic. The N stream goes through and out the other end, and it has all the broken down materials from the air itself. And when the products are broken down, they're rendered as non-greenhouse gases as well. And it becomes an important stream for actually thermally destroying polluted components in the feed air that supply this ceramic with the oxygen for the O stream. So it's really simple. There are very few moving parts. This is essentially what the final design looks like. And you stack them up in stacks like this, and you can, based on the capacity of the tube, you can calculate your productivity sizes. So if we look at this one, for example, this is a 70-foot by 100-foot factory, and it puts out about 813 tons of oxide a year. So from that, we can do all the chemistry we'd need to based on the known pollution constituents of the atmosphere, and we can determine that for open air capture, this plant that we're looking at will treat 245 million tons of CO2 equivalent gases per year. And 1/10 of that is what we would be able to do with a plant that strictly focuses on CO2 removal. So it's basically 10 times more expensive to remove CO2 directly from a point source like a smokestack. So we have some options that we'll go through that will open this up. This air scrubbing system, which is also another opportunity to do with this technology application, is a residue-free air washing technique where the oxide is fed into water, and then there is also oxide that mixes with the water and the open air, and it removes the water as soiled water to a mineral soil drain field for mineralization to carbonate rocks. Minerals can also be made such as calcium carbonate, but if we really want a quick removal, we can just actually use similar to a drain field technique and recapture all the water to recycle in this system and continually remove all the greenhouse gases with a direct air capture approach. Here's the point source cost. We call this our smokestack janitor. Basically what we can do is the oxide gas that comes from the ceramic can be piped directly into the flue gas. And we can do that at varying speeds depending on the concentration of water in the flue gas. And most people understand that our flue gases typically contain water. We can leverage the water that's in the flue gas to make the hydroxyl. It immediately neutralizes all nitrous oxide and mineralizes CO2. And the nitrous acid that is formed in the open atmosphere with the plume becomes a reservoir of hydroxyl every morning. It will be captured as nitrous acid as a reservoir. So we also have, with this CO2 falling to the ground permanently, it does mineralize the CO2 permanently. I want people to understand that we, can influence that right from a plume. So your small particulate matter is made more water soluble, which helps with longevity of people and animals around these factories, and they're removed more quickly and therefore much less harmful. So if we want to do an approach where we want to cool the planet up to 2.1 degrees Celsius, which includes some of the methane warming we haven't experienced yet, but which is probably quite likely baked in, we would take 70 acres of the technology I've shown you over 20 years in an open air dispersal to achieve that kind of cooling. And these are some of the features of it. How many tons of CO2, how much power over 10 to 20 years. Note that the ceramics are 100% recyclable. So for all the trouble we go to for mining for the minerals that are made up in the ceramic, we can recycle them 100%. And it's important to know that compared to other greenhouse gas removal technologies, there is an order of effectiveness that is important to know, because we go for the short-lived climate pollutants and the synthetic greenhouse gases relatively quickly, and then the CO2 is also mineralized out. And we spread the focus across all of them, knowing that the oxidation function is the fastest way to cool the planet down and buy us some time for our CO2 problem. So as of 2020, the full-size dispersal system can cool about 2.1, but just to deal with CO2 head-on, it's 10 times more expensive. So it's also a much larger technology. We would have to multiply it by basically 470 times to get a 50 square mile footprint of our working technology, and the electricity that is needed to be installed is 71,677 megawatts. But this would completely suppress all CO2 emissions that are historically existing in the atmosphere. And believe it or not, that still quite possibly could be one of the cheapest CO2 treatments for the point source of CO2. We think we'll just share the costs as time goes by and let people decide for themselves which way they want to go, because there are some other principles involved. A hydroxyl release offers shorter term cooling. So this is one of the things we need to be aware of as one of its positive features versus dealing with carbon dioxide. It's important to note that all the other greenhouse gases besides CO2 take up about 35% of the current global warming we have, and CO2 itself is taking up about 65% of that warming. And if we look at the ppm levels of each, we'll see that all the other greenhouse gases are basically 1.7 parts per million, but they're 250 times more potent as a group than the CO2. So they do, they are a very serious part of the threat to humanity. And the last column that I show here in this table is the relative removal cost. So that's the difference for us, the way we approach it. It's 10 times more expensive to go directly for the CO2. Okay, so, and it would then not buy you the same amount of time. It would be on a different time frame. So a couple of the key takeaways is that it's known we need to reduce the fossil fuel, but we're going to need about 3 to 4 COVID-19 level shutdowns. So as technology providers, we want you to know that we want to participate in helping to do this, total emissions reduction with emissions removal as quickly as possible. Open air hydroxyl dispersal at scale can quickly, over 10 years, lower the temperature. It may eventually be the cheapest long-term option for CO2 removal as well, but we have to scale a little bit first before we can be completely firm on how inexpensive it is. It is an order of magnitude cheaper already at the smaller scale than other greenhouse gas removal technologies. So while these systems are running, it's important to note they are always cleaning the air that they take in, and they remove existing greenhouse gases in the feed air, in addition to the pollutant removal provided by the dispersed hydroxyl product. So it's a very power-packed way to treat greenhouse gases. The advanced oxidation approach is nature-based, low-tech, portable, modular, residue-free, and it's permanent and green sequestration of the greenhouse gases. So this is just a quick reminder in this slide of the tipping points. If we use a holistic approach like a large-scale release of hydroxyl, we're going to shave off the progress which each of these have made significantly by lowering the temperature and focusing on the root cause of the greenhouse gases that are in the atmosphere now. So we'll just affect all of them in a proportionate amount based on their progression. Some recommendations that we have are that we invest in the oxidation of non-CO2 greenhouse gases by an open air release to buy us up to 2.1 degrees Celsius of cooling, and possibly quickly reverse some unwanted tipping points. CO2 removal will become relatively less urgent because of the fact that we can come in and do this cooling, and this will buy everyone more time if we need it to scale up the best available CO2 technologies. Okay, so just so you know, here's an overview of the advanced oxidation routes that can be applied. There's a hydroxyl dispersal. There's a direct air capture or scrubbing of all greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. Then there's the smokestack janitor, where we pipe the oxide into the flue gas. We also have targeted stack CO2 removal, which captures CO2 from a smokestack and can make mineral products with that. We also want to mention that we can help with removal of methane, which is residue-free, by injection or contactor systems at remote sites. And there is a pH remediation component that the oxidant can bring to acid problems. So that's the whole field that we are proposing needs to be incorporated into our thinking a little bit more. It has been somewhat left as a specialty area, being called advanced oxidation, but as you can see, it's actually very simple. It's not really high tech, and it's more of a remedial chemistry than it is a geoengineering technique. So from that, I would just like to give you back the control, David, and thank you again for letting me talk about this with everyone here on the salon.
Yes, thank you, Viva, for this presentation. And certainly this is a fascinating concept that you have illustrated. Now, given that it is new to many of us, I think we will have a lot of questions just in terms of trying to understand the proposal. And my question is, where do you get the input gases that your system would process to generate the hydroxyl radicals? You mentioned that essentially an oxide gas would be taken in. Where would it be found? Would it just be a byproduct of emissions, or would you have to specially import it essentially in order for the factories to operate?
Okay, we take the oxygen out of ordinary air. So we have suction that pulls the air from the open atmosphere into the system, into the ceramic, and the 21.9% component of air that is oxygen is where we get the oxide gas from. And it is across that ceramic membrane, it's transformed into the oxide radical with a little bit of pressure being applied and some heat inside the ceramic. So then it filters out just the oxide through the surface of the ceramic itself. It's basically a smart ceramic. And then the nitrogen and all of the other components that are in the atmosphere are thermocatalytically, which just means that they're in a slightly enhanced way because of the presence of the minerals. They're broken down while that oxygen leaves. There is some breaking down happening of all the synthetic greenhouse gases that came in with the air, and we release that with the nitrogen, and the weather then will take all of those constituents, pretty much all of them, out safely and bring them to ground. So our feed gas for this approach is the air. Okay, I could talk about some other feed gas that we've used, but for this particular application, we're getting it just from ordinary air, and we're cleaning up the air as we use it.
So you can essentially build a factory of the sort you describe anywhere in the world, and it would work just as well as anywhere else.
Yeah, it can be all, we can have one centralized location at a good latitude, say 50 degrees north, where the troposphere is thick enough to allow the release to happen from ground, and let the chemistry unfold as these Pac-Men go out and react with whatever they encounter that we don't need for either the health of our planet or our own health. And it takes about 2 weeks to 3 weeks for it to start significantly mixing in at a global scale from one point.
So it is interesting. You are based in Canada, from what I understand. If you were to build this kind of facility in Canada, would it have benefits throughout the world, essentially? So people in China, people in Africa, would they experience improvement in terms of CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere above them?
Yes, they would eventually. Of course, this is the caveat that all of the technologies have. We have to be able to think of that at scale. We have to scale up to match those global greenhouse gas levels. So yes, at scale, it would affect everybody, thereby would change the global temperature.
And in terms of this scale, would it be possible to implement it through the efforts of one company, one organization, or in your view, would it require some sort of international collaboration just to have the resources to build enough facilities to have the 2.1 degree cooling effect that you've mentioned?
Yeah, we think the global collaboration is starting to emerge. We're proponents of that at the political level. We write letters to help people identify that we need to have the task of looking at technologies done right from the political level all the way through all the scientific levels as quickly as possible, because the root cause is too many greenhouse gases floating in the atmosphere. Okay, the two ways that they're being exacerbated is the removal is not happening and the emission reduction is not fast enough. So it's definitely going to be a global collaboration, but we can, our business model is CO2 offsetting, where we would charge a certain amount for a CO2 equivalent, which I've shown some of the prices there. So for the open air release right now, we project that it'll only cost anyone who buys from us $5 a CO2 equivalent to produce the oxide to remove that CO2 equivalent. And the government machinery is being put in place as we speak for paying for these kinds of services on a more of a mandated level, because we're realizing that we're really not going to get out of confronting the fact that we have to remove gases back out of the atmosphere on top of reducing emissions. So as soon as we all come to that mindset, then we'll all be ready. And some of us are already started on that.
So I have one last technical question before I ask some of the other panelists for their questions. You mentioned a CO2 equivalent. In what units is that measured, just so that we can get an idea?
That's a CO2 unit equivalent is 1 ton of CO2 equivalent warming, okay? But when you look at the other greenhouse gases, some of them are far more potent. Some of them are over, 800 times more potent. So what we do is we prorate all the gases potencies across that wide spectrum. And, it's really boils down to a simple amount of 1 ton of CO2 as the baseline 1 unit.
Understood. Thank you. And now we have a question from Dan Elton. Dan, please proceed.
Yeah, thanks. Actually, I have 2 questions. Well, I guess I'll just jump right in. The first was, I was wondering if this technique produces ozone as well, and if that could be a possible hazard for people that are, say, in close proximity to the facility.
Yeah, the oxide radical is lighter than air, so it lofts. So we have an advantage already just simply by gravity being on our side. And so a plume characterization would involve the plume primarily moving upward. There are other, weather events locally that could change that, but it's still going to be released from a stack so that it is elevated above. The oxide radical prefers by itself to mostly become hydroxyl by touching a water molecule and reacting with it. That radical is preferential to water. So right there we have a lot of protection against this atomic oxygen participating in any ozone cycling.
Okay. Now the other thing is that, as I understand it, I was wondering if you could provide a clarification, because it seemed like you discussed two separate things. You discussed the hydroxyl radical, which can be used as sort of a scrubber, but then you also talked about CO2 mineralization. And am I right to understand those are two separate technologies?
Yeah, they're two separate chemical processes. The main thing that the hydroxyl does is it oxidizes. So it takes an electron from whatever it contacts that an electron can be stolen from. With CO2, though, it doesn't oxidize CO2. CO2 is already the oxide of carbon. And fortunately, though, we have a buffering mechanism in water that the hydroxyl radical can greatly enhance, and thereby make any water that's got higher levels of hydroxyl also capture the CO2. And so the mineralization from the buffering is where we get the permanent removal of the CO2 as well. It's just done by a different chemical process.
Could the mineralization occur in the ocean as well, or is it where does that occur?
The mineralization occurs either on contact with elements in the atmosphere that are already up there, or when it touches ground, it will also mineralize in mineral soil. So it needs contact with a mineral. Now in the ocean, it's hydrogen, H2CO3, hydrogen carbonate, but then it quickly will also revert into all the other minerals that can mineralize: sodium, calcium, potassium. And as we know, if you've been in this field at all, potassium hydroxide is used in one of the other CO2 removal technologies. So it is using the mineralization route for that.
And then finally, while I have you, I was curious what you think about other geoengineering or carbon capture approaches, because it seems like this approach could be very useful, but we may not want to go with only this approach. So there's a lot of other approaches out there. For instance, one that I've seen is just planting a lot of trees, and basically having drones flying over certain areas in, say, Russia, and planting trees.
Yes.
And there's been other discussions like putting the CO2 under the ground, or putting some kind of something into the atmosphere which actually reflects the sunlight. So I'm curious, what are your favorite other approaches that you think could be used in a complementary fashion to mitigate climate change, either carbon capture or geoengineering type approaches?
Yeah, I've recently, thank you, looked at a couple that I consider the most promising from a more therapeutic approach that's less invasive, less over-engineered. over too many chemicals, unwanted residues, all these things that we have to do that are constraints to the technology. And I think that the mirrors project is very promising for geoengineering. And that's the placement of mirrors all over in key places to increase the leaving the albedo of the planet that way. Also, I do like the mineralization of CO2 with the rock dust, but I think they're going to have to figure out a better way to scale it up than spreading it all over geographically. If there's a way that they can speed that up, that would be great. Of course, that would involve more cost because you're probably looking at finding a mechanical advantage, which again comes back to more engineering. The aerosols are we have to remember that they're only a stopgap, whether they've been applied in local weather engineering operations or whether they bring on calcium oxide as a global intervention, they're still a stopgap. So I tend to gravitate towards the root cause approaches, including planting more trees, but we know that it's exponentially not enough. It's 1/10 of what is needed. So we do need some mechanical advantage. Dispersal in our case is a different paradigm than sucking the whole atmosphere to the equipment. It takes 1/55 millionth of the atmosphere to do a dispersal, so that you can see correspondingly the equipment is much less. Also, do we want to consider that we may be in a lot of stress trying to run these technologies, so they need to be easy to adopt. So those are the primary ones that I think that I feel confident should go forward so far, if I was to be the judge. And the situation is, though, that we still need everybody working where they are until we understand how we're going to coordinate. And hopefully we start talking about coordination very soon at the political level.
Wow, great. Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah. Thank you.
David, you had a question or a comment?
Yes, thank you. Viva, I was just curious on a couple of fronts. Electrical requirements, what it takes to power this, whether it be smokestack or direct air capture. And then the second part of that is, what's the noise signature of this like?
Okay. Well, I'll answer the noise signature first. Basically, we don't need fans to bring the air in. We can just use modestly taxed suction from compressors, and their noise level is quite controllable at about 70 decibels. And so if you stick it off by itself, it's quiet from a few acres away, and it doesn't cause any negative noise consequences. And the electrical requirement, which is the only big input beside the tubes being recycled once a year, is about 700 watts per ceramic tube, and that includes all the controls and everything on it. And by the time all of that's put on it, it's for the 70-foot by 100-foot factory, it's going to use up about 1.5 megawatts of energy installed. Okay, so that's the output off that factory photograph. It's about 1.4 megawatts. And that'll get the release up the stack and everything.
Okay, well, thank you. I was thinking that the energy requirement probably plays into the location of these standalone units, as well as other factors such as air currents and so forth. So perhaps the location also helps if you can have wind or solar power or something assisting in generating this electricity. Is that something that's being thought about?
Yes, we want green electricity for it. And so the location we're in is a fairly modestly populated semi-desert area of British Columbia. And we think that we can find the appropriate property and that we are close enough to a small hub city where we can get all the expertise we need to construct and expand here in Kamloops, British Columbia, as a base of operations with the cooperation and the consent of all of the stakeholders that we're starting to talk to now. Yeah.
Oh, excellent. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yes, thank you. And now we have some questions from Jason Geringer. Jason, would you like to pose them?
Yeah, when I was looking at your slides, well, first of all, it's awesome you're doing this because, I mean, you know, we need this kind of technology because I don't think trying to talk everybody into, you know, burning less fossil fuels is going to work all that great. But when I was looking at your slides, I noticed you mentioned something about 3 or 4 COVID shutdowns. And I was wondering what that was about because I don't think people are going to like it.
No, this is why I think our technology and equivalent technologies are going to be looked at fairly soon, because we're going through the thought process of understanding that the COVID level drop of greenhouse gases that we just had, that is now shown on all our graphs, that equivalent 4 times over or 3 times over needs to happen across developed society for us to get into the range of emissions that will give us a safe temperature rise. So it's pretty harsh. I mean, COVID was hard.
So you weren't recommending 3 or 4 shutdowns, just that amount of reduction in, okay, I get it.
Yeah, reduction in, you know, mobility. I mean, you know, let's face it, our cars, we just right there, that's just gone, you know, for a lot of us. So it's pretty major, but that was the intimation of that statement.
The other thing, I think I saw that one of those processes were going to cost $40 trillion, or maybe that was 40 tons. I'm wondering, what do you think it might cost overall to clean up the whole planet? Like,
well, we still are estimating based on the productivity of the ceramic. So some of the front end engineering is not done on the stacks, but we know the basic flow for our technology, so we know our outputs and our inputs quite well. And to do these remediations, we have to remember that they're going to occur over decades, right? So even the fastest one, possibly ours being one of the fastest ones, is the total price over 20 years is about 40 trillion. So if 2 trillion a year to get us completely out of jail and well into removing CO2, at this point, there's a question that I would put out there. If we want to take the measure of removing all the other greenhouse gases, what safety buffer would we have? Well, CO2 levels will serve as a bit of a buffer because they'll keep the warm blanket warm while we remove all those other constituents. So the CO2 problem will be downsized by the removal of all the other greenhouse gases. And it seems that dispersal is probably a very fast technique compared to sucking the whole atmosphere to the equipment, you know, on several levels, logistically and financially.
Do you think that there's a chance we could disperse too much and then like take too much carbon dioxide out of this? Because I mean, we need some greenhouse gases, right? Don't we?
Well, I think that, yeah, you're right. We do. We need to watch the global situation and see how the planet responds. And just some basic things that need to be watched are understanding that whatever we do in the troposphere takes about 5 years to materialize up into the stratosphere. So if we go in 3 to 5 year bursts with our scaled technology, then stop and observe, and then observe for a couple of years, understand what has happened and can characterize it, and then do another burst. This is going to slow it down a little bit, but it's going to make it safe, and it's also going to make it so that we have an opportunity to manage the cooling.
Yes, indeed. And I was thinking about, with this technology, how to implement a coordinated monitoring approach so that indeed we could measure any incremental progress and know that we're not overshooting the target in any manner that would reduce the atmospheric concentrations of carbon dioxide too far. So I'm glad that you proposed this kind of periodic monitoring approach, and also that you recognize essentially the scale of this effort. And I'm curious in terms of how to distribute that effort, because of course, one company is not going to be able to get $40 trillion even over the course of 20 years. I don't think any company in the world has ever had that volume of resources. But potentially, if there are facilities like this within each country, and perhaps they are funded by a combination of private and governmental sources, depending on which country it is, which economic system it has. China would probably have a very different approach toward it than would occur in the United States and Canada. Could that be a viable approach, and then some sort of international treaty or set of ongoing negotiations could be used to determine essentially which country contributes how much to the cleanup? What do you think of this?
Okay, well, we are a different type of singular organization. We hold a private corporation status for two reasons. We were a startup that for profit, but as time has gone by, we've been watching this for a while. We also know that you have to have certification as a corporation for hiring chemical professionals, engineering professionals, that sort of thing. So that's another reason. There are different types of corporations now, and there are different types of governance models emerging that have different hybridizations between private and public sector policy and socialism and capitalism. These mixes and hybrids are really where humanity is experimenting, and we are open to seeing completely what emerges for this. The technology we have is a public good, as is all of the ones that are being put forward, so they have a specific status on their own in the government's eyes. The Canadian government looks at backing private technologies from the private sector if they're public goods. So we deal with the infrastructure of the atmosphere, and we believe that infrastructure items need to be looked after by governments in some measure, and make sure that there are standards in place for the availability of them. So does that cover the territory you'd like to in your question, Gennady?
I think it's a good start. We have a question from one of our viewers that I think goes along well with this. Our member Mike Lazine asks, where can these plants be built here in the USA? Do you have any thoughts about that? And even if you don't have a particular location in mind, some characteristics of the surrounding environment, perhaps, that would make these kinds of plants more effective?
Okay, they can go in just about any area that has a light industrial infrastructure. So, and even commercial building infrastructure. So the building that you saw in my slide presentation, it's no more complicated than that. We can go a couple of stories in height. So the pipe works, get standard pretty quickly on these units, and so they thread together quite readily. Plastics will also be looked at for some of the piping costs. Right near residential areas are acceptable if the airshed characterization shows that the oxide will continuously and consistently loft up into the cloud deck.
Yes, thank you. And we also have a question from Jennifer Hughes, who asks, if we wanted to cut it down to being completed in a decade, could we, or do these proposals require 20 years to be implemented fully?
I don't know the answer to that. I mean, there is a point at which the amount of money will not change the ability to scale. The two will go out of match, So where that happens for me is what I've shown in the predictions. I think that a very aggressive scale up for us, if money were not an issue, is still in the range of 14 to 18 years with a really good team. Yeah.
Yes, David, please go ahead.
Yeah, since we're on the topic of money, you were mentioning mineralized carbon, mineralized carbon dioxide. Is there a market for that? Or are there potential spin-off to
Yes.
what we pull out of the atmosphere, and obviously then maybe that can help fund part of what's going on as well?
The business case really isn't there for doing a direct air capture, which is scrubbing the atmosphere for CO2 by bringing the air to the hydroxyl. But if we have a stack operator that wants to capture the CO2 and in their flue gas and then mineralize it, there is a business case for that. Okay, but not for the open air capture or the direct air of the whole atmosphere. It's just the market for minerals is still pretty cheap, and it's a well-developed market. So there's not a lot of money in that market to capitalize on with this application, except if they're doing pure CO2 capture.
Okay.
At a stack, at a point source.
One of our members, Daniel Yeluashvili, is very much interested in carbon capture and sequestration. I spoke with him about this subject approximately a year and a half ago, and he mentioned the possibility with carbon capture of even creating bricks from the captured material. Would that be the pure carbon capture that you describe? And in that event, do you think it could be viable, for instance, as a construction material, given that right now there is an increasing scarcity of some commonly used construction materials, such as lumber?
Yes, I think we need to scale a little bit more with the actual spin-offs with our technology, but the main spin-off would be minerals. Now, the thing that I'm excited about with masonry is the plastics that are going into the masonry. So maybe we can work in tandem with that, but it's still the minerals market. When they get short, they will have a source of minerals from our CO2 removal. They will have a source of carbonates for sure.
Great. And Jason, you have another question as well.
Yeah, you mentioned that the oxide radical likes water, and that it will also take out some of the synthetic greenhouse gases and that. Does it have to run out of water before it'll start eating the CO2 and the other greenhouse gases, or does it kind of do them both at the same time as they go out, or?
It has a very short lifetime. The average lifetime of the hydroxyl radical in the open atmosphere is about 2 seconds. But it reacts down into the nanoseconds, depending on what it encounters. So it's a very fast technique, and it's good to know that lifetime. Dr. Michael Prather, who's the Fred Kavli Chair at UCI Berkeley, is the person who actually did go on to determine the lifetime and the concentration of the hydroxyl radical around us. So it's very fast, and it is somewhat temperature dependent. So in a hot stack, you're going to get really fast reactions, really fast.
The other thing I was kind of wondering, it looked like the machines were kind of small, and then you stack them up and make a whole bunch of them. Well, is there any possibility you could have like small ones and hook them to the exhaust on people's car, or smaller, you know?
Yeah, the ceramic is somewhat fragile. Okay, it under dropping stress, they can crack. So anything that shakes them and jerking motion put them at risk of cracking, and as soon as that happens, they're no good. So the mobility involves transporting all of the equipment around the tube first and getting it placed, and then padding the ceramics in transit. And once you get them safely to the site, get them in and get them working, and no more bumping. So they require a little bit of care.
Mm-hmm. So you probably wouldn't want to build your factories in seismically active zones either then.
No.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they'll just crack. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yes, that rules out much of the west coast of the United States, unfortunately. You'd have to go farther inland in order to get out of seismically active areas.
We have a seismic detector in the equipment so that they turn off before the seismic goes too high.
Mm-hmm. Now, John Halloran asks for you to clarify prior statements that you made. Do you intend, if your proposal is implemented, for there to be periodic 5-year or so shutdowns of the carbon removal system operations in order to determine their effects on the stratosphere? Or do you envision more like a rolling series of reviews, like if you run the system for 4 years and then in the 5th year you're still running it, but scientists are studying the effects and perhaps publishing their report even while the system is running, and then there might be some sort of process to assess the results and determine whether to keep it running at the same level or maybe dial it down a bit. What is your vision for how that would happen?
Okay, well, the government machinery, a lot of it is already in place for the permitting of greenhouse gas offsetting and carbon offsetting. So a company like us, we write out our protocol, our procedures, what we propose to remove, how it removes logically. This is scrutinized and given peer review by organizations in the offsetting market. So it gets peer reviewed how you work and what you claim, to make sure that it's accurate so that the trust for everyone is preserved. The whole global situation is a commons for everybody to know about. And so the review processes that are already in place would just expand to accommodate the global scale up. And it typically involves regular review, and those review bodies will expand as we scale up whatever we're going to scale up. Those review bodies, whether they're public or private or a combination thereof, all of those things are going to emerge over the next 5 years, much more.
Mhm. Yes, I would imagine that as this technology develops, the emphasis on measuring its effects will increase as well. Art Ramon, do you have any questions for Viva?
Yes, as far as the smart ceramic, can you tell us more about that? What does it cost? Does it have to be manufactured in any particular way? Like, does it need to be 3D printed and porous? Can you tell us more? Also, what other industries use this kind of ceramic? Will there be competition to actually have these made? Can you tell us more on that?
Good question. Yeah. The ceramic is a solid oxide, okay, which comes out of the hydrogen fuel cell and fuel cell field. This is a field which has been slowed down by other green technologies such as solar and electric, particularly in the vehicles field, where the hydrogen fuel cell was going to be the big thing in Canada for a while, but then the real cost of electric cars came in and completely changed that market's outlook. So what we had was some infrastructure growth with solid oxide fuel cell mining and development that got cut back because the market direction changed its future. And the supply chain for the ceramic it has been looked at, it is quite large. So it's globally, the access to the minerals that are in the solid oxide are globally available. And the technique for making the pipe it's a ceramic, so it's fired. Now, typically they construct them with a mold. The technology to automate that, I haven't seen it emerge yet. So 3D printing of those, I haven't seen it happen yet. We would watch for that. And the nice thing about it is once these ceramics wear out, you can smash them up in a ball mill and add heat to them and then recapture all the mineral and reform them into new tubes. So they're sustainable from a supply chain perspective.
All right, thank you.
You're welcome.
Excellent. So now we have some questions from Jennifer Hughes, who asks, would we be able to remove more pollution from one site by building more vertically? And she is clarifying that she wants to consider the site proposal estimates and that if we extend vertically, she would want to make the buildings as disaster resistant as possible. So if you had like a skyscraper with these tubes inside it, would it have a more concentrated effect on the immediate area where it's located, or does the shape not particularly matter as much?
No, it matters. You know, when you're bringing the air in and you're starting to go to scale, there is large movement in the air shed. So the upstream side feeding the machine and the downstream side releasing the nitrogen back to the atmosphere have to be balanced. You can definitely shrink the footprint by going up, as long as your air shed movement is not perturbed as by it, and it can be projected depending on the cloud deck and whether you're in a valley, so the geography is looked at. So you can do them in, you could do them in the middle of the city as well too. As long as the venting lofts the oxide upwards with the hydroxyl, you can go in numerous different places. And they do come with the seismic sensing equipment on them, but that doesn't necessarily stop the earthquake from cracking the ceramic. Okay, it's just turned off when it's cracked. Yeah.
Yes, indeed. And this is quite fascinating. I, for one, would enjoy seeing some skyscraper-sized buildings in large cities that contain this kind of technology. Jennifer is campaigning to become the mayor of Camden, New Jersey, and she has expressed the desire to get the air cleaned in her city, which is one of the more polluted cities in the United States. And she is curious about the cost projections to clean a metro city. Is it feasible to do, say, for some amount of money in the millions or tens of millions? Because, of course, the 40 trillion figure that you cited over 20 years, it may seem a bit daunting from somebody who is trying to perhaps solve some more local problems. But do you have any idea of how much cleaning the pollutants in the surrounding area of a city would cost using this technology?
Yes, we do have some ideas of it. We would like to, we can be accurate enough with a specific scenario given to us. The thing that Jennifer would have to know is to add in dispersal infrastructure such as piping, because you could actually, in a local situation, take control of releasing it from multiple points through a pipe work system through the city, and then get it treating the air quality, because hydroxyl is used indoors for air quality. It's FDA approved for indoors. She may know that already. So if we put it outdoors, it basically takes care of 99.9% of mold, fungus, and bacteria in a closed space. But it'll also do a significant percentage of that by being released and dispersed as something a little bit in more proximity to people. You can already have it in the background indoors. So, the FDA has signed off on that. So we think that the same principle applies for outdoor as well, just as long as it's the hydroxyl radical.
And are there any safety concerns that you're aware of with that, or as far as you know, is it entirely benign in terms of having the hydroxyl radical in the vicinity of people at any concentration that these systems could reasonably produce?
Well, in the occupational health and safety regulations, the hydrogen peroxide regulation is that you are to have only a maximum of 3 parts per million in any area for a period of 8 hours. That's the exposure limit. So the oxide from the hydrogen peroxide is more electronegative than the oxide that comes off of these ceramics. So it's in a different order of magnitude, but we would still say, let's follow the 3 ppm limit, and then get a little bit more data on it from the environment where you're applying a pilot project. And then from there, you'll know a hard number. But with hydrogen peroxide, it's 3 ppm. And so we would say we would work within those guidelines for this different type of oxygen.
Yes, that makes sense. And now we have an interesting question from one of our viewers, French Tanker, who says, quote, I'm actually quite interested in how this would affect the way some animals grow. And he says, from what he has read, the reason we don't have massive spiders is because of global warming and its effect on the atmosphere. Can you comment at all on animal growth and how it might be affected by either climate change or this technology? Do you think this will affect in any way how the composition of ecosystems develops over time?
Yeah, okay. Well, we know from some studies that have been done by Odorox, which is a company that provides indoor air hydroxyls, that it is 99.9% of mold, fungus, and bacteria, which all fall within the unwanted categories: unwanted mold, unwanted bacteria. So the aerobic biome, which is usually not unwanted, usually wanted, is actually allowed to be vital and thriving with a well-oxygenated, well-ionized atmosphere. So as far as it translating into size changes and epigenetics and stuff, I haven't seen anything there yet, except that hydroxide with plants has been tested. The Mormons have sprayed their crops with hydrogen peroxide, and it's caused a stress signaling that made the plants a little bit more robust. So in direct applications, there are some possibilities, but we're focusing on a global overall level change, which dilutes it a great deal.
Yes, thank you. And I want to say one of the aspects that I like about your proposal is that it can indeed allow humankind the opportunity to essentially gradually implement other changes that could perhaps permanently alleviate the problem of climate change. I do think it will be necessary to phase out the use of fossil fuels within about the next 30 years. However, the US Transhumanist Party also holds that it's necessary to do that without causing disruption to ordinary people's lives and without imposing burdens on everyday individuals or lowering their standards of living. So one example of technologies that do achieve that are the technologies that have been forwarded by Elon Musk. He has popularized the electric vehicle, and if he can get the costs down to the point where most typical consumers are able to get an electric car, that cuts down dramatically on greenhouse gas emissions from gasoline. Another technology that he is involved with, as well as a lot of other providers, is of course solar power. And solar power is becoming competitive with power generated from coal and natural gas. And given the rate of advancement of these technologies already, we can project that into the future and see that it's quite realistic to have all of our needs in terms of our standard of living be met by cleaner, more renewable sources of energy going forward. But this approach can work in concert with that because it could get rid of carbon dioxide excess concentrations in the atmosphere at the same time, allowing the economy and the infrastructure to shift to cleaner energy more gradually, less disruptively, so that people who have automobiles that burn gasoline will not need to dispose of them prematurely. They could perhaps continue to use them until they wear out, and then they buy their next car, which is an electric car. And that way, the infrastructure gets replaced kind of on its natural life cycle instead of more expenditure being put in to scrap it. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, it's going to be interesting. I'm sure that the politicians that are thinking of this are now going to be dealing with that issue, as you just mentioned, Kennedy. What are we going to do in terms of balancing the standard of living for everyone? Because we know that the vulnerable who are not incurring any kind of a carbon footprint, what are we doing with their fair share of standard of living? So what goes into standard of living for who? Okay, so those questions, and I have a feeling that a lot of the politicians who meet for COP26 are very concerned about the interests. We're trying to balance the interests of the very wealthy, who are the big emitters of the world. This has been shown in the mushroom graph very well. How do we ensure that they're accountable for their past emissions plus what they're doing now? And can we get them to please go carbon negative in their personal lives and in their business lives? We need all of the big wealthy people to answer the call to go carbon negative. So that accountability thing has to be brought into this, because it's real. It's very real. So I just like to mention that for sure.
And I think it's important to consider two aspects here. One is, what can individuals do? Two is, what kinds of changes to the infrastructure and the technologies available to individuals are possible, so that people might not even need to exert that much effort in order to have a beneficial effect. Because I think it's good to minimize waste. I think it's good to reuse certain items. For instance, during the pandemic, I have taken on a habit of reusing plastic water bottles. So instead of throwing them away, I might use them 10 times or more, because largely I didn't want to go shopping too frequently. And this, along with a water filter, enabled me to have a steady supply of water less expensively. And I think there are a lot of common household goods, for example, that people don't need to throw away. I think there are a lot of products that should not have any planned obsolescence built into them. And that's another aspect where I think in the larger society, a change can be made that makes it easier for people not to utilize more resources than would be necessary to maintain that standard of living. But there are a lot of other measures as well, technological transformations, that I think could enable people to have the same or similar experience of life, but the output of CO2 associated with that would be much lower. For instance, replacing factory farming of animals with in vitro or lab-grown meat, which is biologically identical to the meat that actually comes from these animals. There are already experiments along these lines, and perhaps within the next 5 years, we'll be able to purchase a lab-grown burger or a lab-grown steak off the shelves of grocery stores. They might initially be more expensive, and I do think people of greater means ought to invest in that market, both as investors and as consumers, in order to help bring it about. But I think this is going to be a great victory in terms of combating climate change, because people will still get their meat, they'll still get the enjoyment out of it. But one, all of these animals that are being factory farmed, they don't have to be killed anymore. And two, over time, the populations of these animals can just naturally decrease to more sustainable levels. And that's another option, essentially, to enable a more gradual transition. So I'm seeing all of these approaches working hand in hand, and I am hoping that it might be possible to arrive at a soft landing for humankind by tackling both the production of CO2 emissions through technology and good habits, and also through proposals like yours, which remove the carbon dioxide that is already in the atmosphere at excess levels.
I think it's going to be a close call at best. So hopefully I believe from our experience seeking out ways to partner with what we think are the logical stakeholders, that politicians are our number one focus, whether you're an activist or a technology provider or a political party. Like, thank you so much as being political people here serving as a platform for this, because we have found that, the political arena has allowed for a lot of foot dragging and fear that I think is based in making sure that the moneyed interests of the world are not inconvenienced too much. So hopefully what you were mentioning about finding a happy medium will also incorporate that issue as well too, because there is a justice component to it that will get more marked as time goes by.
So do you think if we have another virtual Enlightenment Salon in the year 2051, and by the way, if the Transhumanist Party has its way, we will all be here in the year 2051, we will be able to look back and say, well, climate change, it was a major concern in the early 21st century, but through a combination of efforts, humankind overcame that, just like humankind overcame previous problems such as the hole in the ozone layer, for instance, which was an example of a successful global environmental issue that was remedied. Do you think we'll have that ability to say 30 years from now, this is now a problem of historical interest, but not of current relevance?
We are already sustaining losses that are significant. We have people in Africa dying as a direct result of climate change. We have property loss, livelihood loss, community loss, water loss. We already have losses. The whole collective mind will start registering more and more of these losses as time goes by, and it will meet with the point at which we shift. But we have already sustained losses that some people think are too much. But so, we will collectively determine that, and hopefully the more we talk about it, the sooner we will cut the losses, because as climate change continues from here on out, all the engineering that goes into our infrastructure, the costs have been ramped up so that the higher floods, more firefighting equipment, more monitoring equipment, all of those costs, they will be interrupted only by a change in greenhouse gas levels.
And as someone who resides in one of the Western US states, I do experience the impact of climate change on the wildfire seasons, which have become longer and more severe. And many of the most destructive wildfires are in California, which is across the border from Nevada, but the smoke from the fires blows into northern Nevada. And starting in 2013, essentially every single year, there have been some days when northern Nevada is completely blanketed with wildfire smoke, and it's essentially unsafe to go outside. Whereas prior to that, there have barely been any years like this. So I certainly am acutely aware of how this problem can affect everyday standards of living. and there does need to be a combination approach in order to both avert the root cause and also mitigate the effects. Of course, there are other areas like wildland management, having more defensible space in both residential areas and in forests to prevent fires from spreading, clearing out debris that could help. But I would say we need to do all of these things and then some in order to address this problem. Now, I think we are at a point in our virtual Enlightenment Salon where we will go around the panel and ask the individual panelists to provide their final comments or questions, anything else they would like to contribute to this conversation. And then we will conclude with our guest having the last word. So let's begin with David.
First off, Viva, thank you so much for coming here. I think that what you're doing is amazing. It's necessary. There just aren't enough good adjectives that I can throw at it. So thank you so much for coming and sharing that with us. Final question I have has to do with the business model of your company. It seems obvious to me that governments are the customer, but I'm wondering if there are other, in your business model, I'm wondering if there are other customers, philanthropy organizations, even corporate customers that want to, for whatever the reason may be, show that they're limiting, their carbon footprint and so forth. So if you could just talk a little bit about your customers in your business model, I'd appreciate that.
Yes, the market for carbon is divided into two major sectors. There's the compliance market, which is governed by governments, where the offsetting is a must-have. And then there's the voluntary market, where purchasers can enter any size and have made-to-order carbon removal done from tree planting, different projects that are scaling back on CO2 emissions and thereby getting credit for that. So they're output-based credits. That market, the private market, is not well regulated, and it needs to be amalgamated into a global market for the purpose of global warming mitigation. So right now, the voluntary market only looks after about 330 million CO2 equivalents of carbon removal a year, which is a very small amount of the whole that needs to be done at 40 billion tons a year. So there's a massive room for growth. The big entities that are buying large purchases of carbon offsets to green their greenhouse gas portfolios are paying $1 a ton for some CO2 equivalents. Yet we know for sure that if we really look at all the solutions and costs, a ton of CO2 is worth at least $50 in damages to society. So what's happening is the private market is shorting the true value against our future, right? So this is a form of, well, it's carelessness or corruption or some combination of that, where we need to have some more agreement and standard setting put in place for that real cost of CO2 to society. And the society that I'm talking about is the whole, the commons. So it's a globalist thing, but it just shows that we're still suffering from a need to grow.
Thank you.
All right, now we will proceed to Art Ramon Garcia for his final remarks.
No additional questions. Thank you for coming, Viva. It was very informative. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Art Ramon. And now we go to Jason Geringer.
Yeah, I was wondering, does the ceramic get used up, or can you, once it starts going, can it run for almost indefinitely? Or and also, I was wondering, are you working on any other methods for doing the same thing with different things besides the ceramic?
Okay, no other things are being done with the ceramic in our specific area of oxidation. The ceramic is lifetime in this particular application is about a year before the friction of the gas, oxide gas going through the holes, wears it out and it cracks. So that's the wear part. But we can take that leftover ceramic and smash it up and heat it in hot water and create a new ceramic from it. And so it becomes 100% recyclable. So in that way, we're closing the loop on the minerals once we have them in our hands.
Awesome. Thanks for bringing us the good news.
You're welcome.
All right, so now we have come to the point where we would invite concluding remarks from you, Viva, regarding any aspect of this conversation, anything that you would like to add to the discussion or your more general thoughts about it.
Okay, well, I just wanted to say in general around our solutions that we believe that they're nature-based because we are mimicking the natural sewer system of the atmosphere. But what a self-check for everybody is to understand that that natural sewer system is only able to take out 13% of what we put up there now. So our levels, according to the accommodations of Mother Nature, have been very, very over the top in terms of what we emit. We need to get our heads around that we do emit much more than we really think. And to bring it home, we've had COVID. Now, we know that hydroxyl in fresh air cleanses it of bacteria, mold, and fungus. And it's true with the pandemic as well. You can see a correlation here. If only 13% of what we have floating around is removed by the hydroxyl radical, then the other 87% is where we're housing things like a pandemic within all the other many constituents. And since they think, scientists think that the virus rides on particulate matter, you can see that it now becomes obvious. So our lifestyle, our chemical processes where we make trade-offs and create unwanted residues, or over-engineering in any area of our society, we need to have a check on those things because they do in themselves become very wasteful. So the nature-based solution comes out of the fact that the natural sewer system is overwhelmed. And that was part of the reason we went forward with the oxidation processes, is to, fight for longevity of humanity on the short term and the long term.
All right, thank you very much for joining us today and for your quite informative presentation and remarks, as well as for addressing the many questions from our panelists and our viewers. I think a lot of people are curious about your proposed approach, and we look forward to seeing how it develops over the coming months and years. And this is the kind of conversation we like to have in our virtual enlightenment salons, where we do get enlightened about new and innovative pursuits in realms of science and technology and their application to the broader society and the future of humanity. So we will continue along these lines, mostly every Sunday at 1 p.m. US Pacific time. Next Sunday April 4th, please join us for a special panel on reforming the US Food and Drug Administration to enable swifter access to life-saving medicines and vaccines against COVID-19. So we are very much looking forward to that event. And until then, live long and prosper.
Mhm. Thank you.